Sometimes the greatest warriors are those who choose to lay down their swords. In a world where strength is measured by how many enemies you defeat, one man discovered that true power comes from how many broken souls you heal. Einar the Ironhand was once Norway's most feared Viking warrior. After losing everything that mattered to him in battle, he vanished from the raids and disappeared into the wilderness. Years later, he returned to build something no one expected. Deep in the forests, near a remote fjord, this giant of a man created a sanctuary with his bare hands. A place where orphaned children learn to read, where wounded warriors find purpose again, where the forgotten discover they still matter. When Ingrid, a wealthy merchant's widow, comes to inspect these lands for her business empire, she finds something that shakes her to her core. But what could make a woman who controls vast wealth risk everything she's built? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like a shroud of forgotten dreams, and in the distance the sound of wood, striking wood, echoed across the water with the rhythm of a steady heartbeat. Einar the Ironhand paused from his work, his massive frame silhouetted against the pale dawn sky, and wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his scarred hand. The worn prayer beads at his wrist caught the first rays of sunlight, a simple string of carved bone and worn wood that had belonged to his wife, Astrid, before the plague took her and their children 3 winters past. He had carried those beads through every battle since, fingering them during the darkest moments when blood ran thick and the screams of dying men filled his ears. They had been his anchor to humanity when the rage threatened to consume him entirely. Now they served a different purpose, a reminder of why he had chosen to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm. The sanctuary he had carved from the wilderness sprawled before him like a testament to redemption. What had begun as a single modest hall had grown into a complex of interconnected buildings, each one shaped by hand from the ancient pines that grew thick along the fjord's edge. The main hall rose 3 stories high, its timber walls weathered to a silver grey that seemed to blend seamlessly with the morning mist. Smaller buildings clustered around it like chicks around a mother hen. Workshops where wounded warriors learned new trades, dormitories where orphaned children slept safely for the first time in their young lives, and a healing house where those broken in body and spirit could find rest. Every beam, every board, every carefully fitted stone had been placed by Einar's hands. He had worked through seasons of driving rain and bitter cold, through the long darkness of winter nights when the potters, Aurora danced overhead like the ghosts of fallen warriors. The local villagers had thought him mad at first, a giant of a man, scarred from countless battles, choosing to labor alone in the wilderness, rather than seek glory on new raids or claim a place of honor in some jarl's hall. But the children had come first, as they always did. Ragnar, barely 8 winters old, had stumbled into Einar's camp half dead from hunger and cold, his parents lost to a disease that had swept through their village like wildfire. Then came Asta, a girl no more than 10, who had witnessed her family's murder by raiders and hadn't spoken a word since. One by one, they had found their way to him, the forgotten, the abandoned, the broken. Einar had seen enough death to fill 100 lifetimes. He had been the shadow that struck terror into enemy hearts, the iron fist that shattered shield walls, the nightmare that haunted the dreams of those who dared oppose him in battle. His name had been spoken in whispers across the northern seas, a legend that grew with each telling. The Iron Hand, they called him, for his grip was said to be strong enough to crush a man's skull like an egg. But that man had died the day he buried his family. What rose from those ashes was something different, still powerful, still formidable, but tempered by loss into something far more precious than any weapon. He had learned that true strength wasn't measured by how much you could destroy, but by how much you could protect and nurture. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention away from his memories. A small party of riders emerged from the tree line, their cloaks rich with fur, and their horses fine-bred animals that spoke of wealth and status. At their head rode a woman whose bearing commanded attention, even from a distance. She sat her horse with the confidence of someone accustomed to having her orders followed. Her auburn hair caught back in an intricate braid that spoke of careful attention to appearance despite the journey. Ingrid Eriksdottir, daughter of the late Jarl Erik the Bold and widow of the merchant Prince Magnus the Wealthy, had come to inspect her newest acquisition. The lands surrounding Einar's sanctuary had fallen into her possession through a complex web of debts and political maneuvering that she had orchestrated with the precision of a master chess player. Her merchant fleet was the largest in the northern territories, her warehouses filled with goods from as far south as Constantinople and as far west as the mysterious lands beyond the great ocean. She had not expected to find anything more significant than timber and perhaps a fishing village or two. Her surveyors had reported virgin forests ripe for harvesting and a deep-water harbour that could accommodate her largest ships. What they had not mentioned was the sprawling complex that now lay before her, or the giant of a man who stood watching her approach with eyes that seemed to weigh her soul. Einar stepped forward as the party drew near, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Even in simple work, clothes, rough-spun wool and leather worn smooth by honest labour, he commanded presence. His shoulders were broad as a bull's, his arms thick with muscle, earned through years of swinging sword and axe, though now those same arms were marked with the calluses and scars of building rather than battle. His hair, once golden, had been touched with silver at the temples, and his beard, neatly trimmed, framed features that spoke of intelligence as much as strength. "Lady Ingrid," he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. It was a voice that had once roared orders across battlefields, now modulated to something gentler but no less powerful. "Welcome to Ironwood Sanctuary." Ingrid dismounted with fluid grace, her expensive boots touching the packed earth of the compound's main pathway. She was smaller than Einar, by far most people were, but she carried herself with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to having her words carry weight. Her green eyes, sharp and calculating, took in every detail of the sanctuary with the practiced assessment of someone who had built an empire through careful observation and shrewd judgment. "Master Einar," she replied, inclining her head just enough to acknowledge his greeting without suggesting deference. "Your reputation precedes you, though the tales spoke of a warrior, not a builder. Men change, my lady. Sometimes the world demands different virtues from us than those we first thought to offer." Around them, the sanctuary was coming alive with the sounds of morning activity. Children's laughter rang out from somewhere behind the main hall, mixed with the steady rhythm of hammers from the workshop where older boys learned carpentry under the guidance of Bjorn One-Eye, a former raider who had lost more than his sight in his final battle. The smell of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen, where Helga the Wise, once a servant in a great hall before age made her unwanted, now fed whoever came to their doors hungry. Ingrid's escort, 4 armed men who served as both guards and advisors, remained mounted, their hands never far from their weapons, despite the peaceful setting. They had heard the stories of Einar the Ironhand, and legends died hard. But as they watched the gentle giant gesture toward his sanctuary with obvious pride, it became clear that whatever danger he might once have represented to enemies, he posed none to peaceful visitors. "May I show you what we've built here?" Einar asked, his tone holding genuine enthusiasm rather than the defensive posture Ingrid had expected. "I think you might find it interesting." Ingrid nodded, her curiosity genuinely piqued despite her natural wariness. She had come expecting to survey land and timber, to calculate profit margins and shipping routes. Instead, she found herself looking at something that defied easy categorization, a place that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of commerce and conquest that governed her world. As they walked toward the main hall, Einar began to speak of his work with the quiet passion of a master craftsman, describing his greatest creation. He told her of the children who had found safety here, the wounded warriors who had discovered new purpose, the old and forgotten who had been given dignity in their final years. His words painted a picture of something unprecedented, a community built not on the traditional bonds of blood and battle, but on the simple recognition of shared humanity. Ingrid found herself listening more intently than she had expected, her merchant's mind trying to understand the economics of generosity, the practical mechanics of compassion. What she heard challenged every assumption she had made about the nature of power and success, leaving her with questions she wasn't certain she wanted answered. The moment that would change everything came not with the clash of swords or the thunder of war horns, but with the soft footsteps of a boy who shouldn't have been walking at all. Leif emerged from behind the main hall, moving with careful deliberation, his left leg dragging slightly as he made his way toward the workshop. The crude wooden crutch that had supported him when he first arrived 2 seasons ago was nowhere to be seen. Instead, he walked with the aid of an ingenious device that Einar had crafted, a framework of carved wood and leather that supported his damaged leg, while allowing him to move with something approaching normal gait. Ingrid's breath caught in her throat. She had seen many wounded warriors in her time, men broken by battle and left to beg or die. But she had never seen one walking with such dignity, such obvious purpose. The boy, he couldn't be more than 16, carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his own worth despite his physical limitations. "Lady Ingrid," Einar said softly, "allow me to present Leif Thorson." The boy approached and offered a respectful bow, his intelligent eyes meeting Ingrid's without shame or pleading. "My lady," he said, his voice clear and steady, "Master Einar has told us of your visit. Welcome to our home." Ingrid found herself momentarily speechless. The boy spoke with education unusual for his apparent station, his words carefully chosen and precisely delivered. But more than his speech, it was his bearing that struck her, the way he carried himself as if his injury were merely an inconvenience rather than a defining limitation. "Leif leads our evening lessons," Einar explained, pride evident in his voice. "He teaches the younger children to read and work with numbers. He has quite a gift for making complex ideas simple." "You teach?" Ingrid asked, unable to hide her surprise. Leif's smile was gentle but confident. "Master Einar believed I had value beyond what others saw, my lady. When you're given such a gift, it becomes your responsibility to pass it forward." The simple statement hit Ingrid with unexpected force. In her world, value was measured in silver and land, in ships and trade routes. People were resources to be managed, assets to be deployed. The idea that someone would see worth in a crippled boy, enough worth to invest time and care in developing his potential, challenged assumptions she had held since childhood. "How were you injured?" she asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. Leif's expression darkened briefly. "A raid on my village 3 years past, my lady. My father was a blacksmith, my mother a healer. They tried to protect our store of grain from raiders. I was caught between a war horse and a stone wall." He paused, his hand unconsciously moving to his damaged leg. "The raiders left me for dead. Said a crippled boy was worth less than a lame horse." Ingrid felt something cold settle in her stomach. Raiders operating under letters of marque from her own merchant house had swept through dozens of villages in the past 3 years, taking what they needed to supply her growing fleet. She had never inquired too closely about the details. Commerce was brutal, and squeamishness was a luxury she couldn't afford. But standing before this boy who had survived such brutality, she found herself confronting the human cost of her ambitions for the first time. "Master Einar found me 2 days later," Leif continued, his voice steady despite the weight of memory. "I was fevered, half mad with pain. He carried me here, set my bones, fought the infection that should have killed me. But more than that, he made me believe I could still matter." Einar's weathered hand rested briefly on the boy's shoulder. a gesture of affection so natural and unself-conscious that it spoke of genuine care rather than calculated kindness. "Leif has taught me as much as I've taught him," he said, "perhaps more." As if summoned by their conversation, other residents of the sanctuary began to appear. An old woman emerged from the kitchen, flour dusting her hands and warmth radiating from her smile. Two boys, neither older than 10, came running from the direction of the workshops, their faces bright with the particular joy of children who felt safe enough to play. A man with a scarred face and empty eye socket stepped out of the stables, moving with the careful precision of someone whose remaining senses had sharpened to compensate for what he'd lost. Each of them greeted Ingrid with respect, but without servility. They carried themselves with the dignity of people who knew they belonged somewhere, who understood their own value in a community that had chosen to see worth where the wider world saw only burden. Ingrid's practiced eye automatically assessed what she was seeing, the quality of the construction, the organization of the work areas, the obvious health and contentment of the residents. What she found challenged every assumption she had made about charitable endeavors. This wasn't a place where the desperate came to die in slightly more comfortable circumstances. It was a functioning community, productive and purposeful. "How do you sustain this?" she asked, her merchant's mind grappling with the economics of what she was witnessing. Food, materials, the resources needed to support so many people. Einar's smile held a hint of the strategic mind that had once made him feared on battlefields. "We trade, my lady. Bjorn's woodworking is sought after by 3 neighboring villages. Helga's healing knowledge has saved lives and earned gratitude that translates to grain and livestock. The boys hunt and fish. Leif keeps precise records of our resources and needs. He has a mind for numbers that would serve any merchant house well. We are not a burden on anyone," Leif added quietly. "Master Einar taught us that charity received must be balanced by value given. We take care of ourselves." The pride in the boy's voice was unmistakable, and Ingrid found herself reassessing everything she thought she knew about dependency and worth. These weren't broken people clinging to survival. They were contributors, creators, individuals who had found ways to transform their limitations into strengths. "Your reputation speaks of a warrior," Ingrid said to Einar, her tone carrying genuine curiosity rather than challenge. "Yet here you are, building rather than conquering. What changed?" Einar was quiet for a long moment, his fingers unconsciously moving to the prayer beads at his wrist. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "I learned that destroying is easy, my lady. Any fool with a sharp blade can tear down what others have built. But creating something that matters, something that makes the world better rather than just different, that takes real strength." The simple truth of his words settled over Ingrid like a physical weight. She had spent her adult life building an empire of ships and trade routes, accumulating wealth and power with single-minded determination. But standing in this sanctuary, surrounded by people who had found purpose in lifting others up rather than climbing over them, she found herself questioning what she had actually accomplished. "I should like to see more," she said finally, her voice softer than it had been since her arrival. Einar nodded, gesturing toward the various buildings that comprised the sanctuary. "It would be my honor to show you everything we've built here. But I warn you, my lady, once you truly see this place, it has a way of changing how you see everything else." As they began to walk deeper into the sanctuary, Ingrid felt the first stirrings of something she couldn't quite name, a sense that she was standing at the edge of a precipice, looking down at a choice that would define not just her immediate future, but the very nature of who she chose to be. The tour of the Pectus State sanctuary proved to be far more than Ingrid had bargained for. What she had expected to be a polite examination of rustic buildings became something closer to a revelation, each structure revealing layers of thought and care that spoke to a philosophy she had never encountered. In the workshop, She watched Bjorn One Eye guide young hands in the precise art of joinery, teaching boys who might have become beggars or thieves to create furniture of remarkable beauty. His missing eye was the result of a Saxon spear thrust in a long-ago raid, but his remaining vision seemed to see possibilities where others saw only obstacles. "The wood tells you what it wants to become," he explained to his students, running scarred fingers along the grain of an oak plank. "Your job is to listen and help it find that shape." Ingrid found herself thinking of her own craftsmen, men who worked in her shipyards under the constant pressure to produce faster, cheaper, with less regard for artistry than efficiency. Here, she watched boys barely into their teens create work that rivaled anything in her father's great hall, their concentration complete and their pride evident in every careful cut. The artifact that caught her attention was a wooden chest sitting in the corner of the workshop, its surface covered with intricate carvings that told the story of the sanctuary's founding. Bjorn had crafted it as a repository for the tools of their trade, but it had become something more, a testament to the transformation possible when skilled hands were given purpose beyond mere survival. "Each carving represents someone who found their way here," Einar explained, noting her interest. "Bjorn adds to it whenever a new resident discovers their gift." Ingrid traced one of the carvings with her finger, a tree growing from broken ground, its roots spreading wide and deep. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. "How many have passed through here? 43 souls have called this place home. At one time or another," Leif said, consulting a leather-bound ledger he carried. 26 remain with us now. The others have gone on to establish homes elsewhere, or returned to families they thought lost forever." The precision of his record-keeping impressed her. In her own enterprises, she employed teams of clerks to manage far simpler accounts, yet this boy maintained detailed records of not just supplies and trade goods, but of human lives and their trajectories. His ledger, she realized, was itself an artifact, a chronicle of redemption written in careful script. "You track their progress even after they leave?" "Master Einar believes we remain responsible for those we've helped," Leif replied. "Not as owners, but as family. We celebrate their successes and offer aid if they stumble." The concept of extended responsibility beyond immediate profit was foreign to Ingrid's experience. In her world, transactions ended when goods and payment changed hands. The idea of maintaining connections, of viewing business relationships as something approaching kinship, challenged her understanding of how the world worked. In the healing house, she met Thora, an elderly woman whose knowledge of herbs and bone setting had made her invaluable in her youth, but who had been cast aside when age diminished her usefulness to her former Jarl. Here, she had found not just shelter but renewed purpose, teaching her skills to others while continuing to practice her art on those who needed healing. "Lady Ingrid," Thora said, her eyes bright with intelligence despite her age, "Einar tells me you command a great fleet. You must see many injuries from the work of ships and sea." The comment was innocent enough, but it forced Ingrid to confront another uncomfortable truth. Her ships were profitable partly because she accepted higher risks than her competitors. Accidents happened with distressing frequency, and injured sailors were typically paid off and dismissed rather than cared for long-term. The cold practicality of such decisions had never troubled her before. "We do what business requires," Ingrid replied carefully. Thora nodded with the understanding of someone who had seen much of life's harsh realities. "Business is important, child, but so are the people who make business possible." The simple wisdom in the old woman's words carried more weight than any lecture Ingrid had ever heard from scholars or priests. Standing in the healing house, surrounded by evidence of what happened when people were valued for their humanity rather than just their immediate usefulness, she felt something shift in her understanding of leadership and responsibility. The afternoon wore on, as Einar showed her every corner of the sanctuary. She saw the dormitories where children slept safely, perhaps for the first time in their lives. She visited the common hall where evening meals brought everyone together, where stories were shared and plans made for the next day's work. She examined the stores where careful management ensured everyone had enough, without anyone taking more than their share. But it was in the library that Ingrid encountered something truly unexpected. In a culture where literacy was often confined to priests and scribes, Einar had assembled a collection of books and scrolls that would have been impressive in any major settlement. More remarkable still, she found children reading these texts with obvious comprehension and enthusiasm. Knowledge should not be hoarded, Einar explained when she commented on the unusual sight. A mind well furnished serves its owner better than one left empty, regardless of that owner's station. The carved reading stand that held the sanctuary's most precious tome, a collection of laws and customs from across the northern lands, bore Bjorn's craftsmanship in its flowing lines and perfect proportions. But it was more than furniture. It was a statement that learning belonged here, that knowledge was as important as food or shelter in the lives these people were building. "Where did you acquire all this?" Ingrid asked, gesturing at the books. "Some were gifts from visitors who found value in what we do here. Others I traded for, paying with the work of our craftsmen. A few," he smiled with what might have been embarrassment, "I may have taken from defeated enemies in my previous life. I prefer to think they serve a better purpose now." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Ingrid found herself struggling with emotions she couldn't quite identify. Everything she had built, every decision she had made in pursuit of wealth and power, suddenly seemed smaller and less significant when measured against what Einar had accomplished in this remote corner of the world. Her escort was growing restless, she could see. They had expected a brief inspection of timber rights and harbour potential, not this extended examination of what they clearly viewed as an elaborate charity house. But Ingrid couldn't bring herself to leave. Not yet. "I need time to think," she announced, surprising herself with the admission. Einar nodded as if he had been expecting this. "You're welcome to stay the night, my lady. We can offer simple accommodations, and tomorrow you might see our morning routines before you decide about the land." The invitation was clearly more than hospitality. It was an opportunity to experience the sanctuary as more than a curious visitor, to understand what life looked like when compassion became a practical philosophy rather than just an abstract ideal. Ingrid looked back toward her escort, then at the sanctuary spreading around them. For the first time in years, she found herself genuinely uncertain about what to do next. The decision to stay proved more complicated than Ingrid had anticipated. Her escort captain, a grizzled veteran named Olaf, who had served her family for 20 years, made his displeasure clear, without directly challenging her authority. "My lady," he said quietly as they prepared their horses for the night, "we have commitments in Bergen. The timber contracts won't negotiate themselves." Ingrid understood his concern. In her world, time was measured in profit and loss, and every day, away from her commercial enterprises, represented opportunities missed or seized by competitors. But something about the sanctuary had created a hunger in her for understanding that couldn't be satisfied with a cursory inspection. "Send word that we're delayed," she instructed. "One night won't destroy our fortunes." Olaf's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced, but he nodded with the resignation of a man who had learned when to argue and when to accept. As her guards made camp near their horses, Ingrid found herself alone with Einar as evening settled over the sanctuary. The great hall filled with sounds that spoke of community, the scrape of benches across wooden floors, the conductors, murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter from the children. Ingrid took her place at a table alongside residents whose stories she was only beginning to understand, feeling both honored and oddly out of place. The evening meal was simple but abundant: fresh fish from the fjord, bread still warm from the ovens, vegetables from gardens tended with obvious care. What struck Ingrid most forcefully was the absence of hierarchy that had governed every meal she had shared since childhood. Here, age and injury commanded respect, but no one deferred simply because of birth or wealth. The artifact that drew her attention during the meal was a simple wooden bowl that Einar placed before her, one of a set that had been carved from a single massive oak that had fallen during a storm. Each bowl bore the marks of careful shaping, but more significantly, each was slightly different, crafted to fit the hands of its intended user. Einar explained that creating personal vessels for each resident was part of their welcome, a way of saying that they belonged here not as temporary guests, but as permanent family. Everyone who stays carves their mark inside their bowl, Leif explained, showing her the interior of his own vessel, where a small tree was etched into the wood. It's our way of saying this place has become part of who we are. Ingrid found herself running her fingers along the smooth rim of the bowl she had been given, wondering what mark she might choose if she were to stay long enough to earn the right. The thought surprised her with its appeal. After the meal, the evening took on a rhythm that felt both ancient and utterly natural. Thora settled into a chair near the great hearth and began telling stories to the children, tales of heroes and magic that held wisdom wrapped in wonder. Some of the older residents gathered around Bjorn as he worked on a new carving, their quiet conversation punctuated by the soft sound of his knife shaping wood. Leif spread his ledgers across one end of the main table and began updating records, while two of the younger boys practiced their letters on slate tablets nearby. The scene spoke of productivity without pressure, of learning as a natural part of daily life rather than something imposed from outside. Ingrid found herself drawn into conversation with a woman named Sigrid, whose husband had been lost in one of the raiding expeditions that had helped build Ingrid's own wealth. Rather than bitterness, Sigrid spoke of the sanctuary as the place where she had discovered her own strength, where grief had transformed into purpose. "I came here expecting to die," Sigrid said simply. "I had nothing left, no family, no skills that seemed valuable, no reason to keep breathing. Einar convinced me that sometimes the greatest service we can provide is simply refusing to give up." The woman's words carried the weight of lived experience, and Ingrid found herself thinking of her own moments of despair, the nights after Magnus's death, when the weight of maintaining their commercial empire had seemed impossible to bear. She had pushed through those dark times through sheer determination, but she had done so alone. The idea that strength could be found in community, that individual resilience could be multiplied rather than depleted by sharing burdens, was a revelation. As the evening progressed, Ingrid began to understand that what she was witnessing wasn't charity in any sense she had previously understood. It was something closer to a revolution, a fundamental reimagining of how human beings could relate to each other when the usual hierarchies of birth, wealth, and physical capability were set aside in favor of something more essential. "Tell me about the raiding," she said to Einar as they walked outside to enjoy the clear night air. "What made you stop?" Einar was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the stars that reflected on the still surface of the fjord. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories that would never fully heal. "I realized I had become very good at taking things from people," he said. "Wealth, safety, hope, sometimes life itself. But I had never learned how to give anything back. After Astrid and the children died, I understood that all the treasure in the world couldn't purchase what I had lost through my own blindness." He touched the prayer beads at his wrist, and Ingrid realized they represented more than memory. They were a promise, a commitment to a different way of being in the world. "So you built this place to make amends?" "I built this place to learn how to live with purpose rather than just power," Einar corrected gently. "The amends, if they're possible, will take longer than one lifetime." Ingrid stood in the darkness beside this man who had chosen transformation over tradition, feeling the foundations of her own world shift beneath her feet. Everything she had worked to achieve, suddenly, seemed both impressive and insufficient. A magnificent structure built on ground that might not be as solid as she had believed. When she finally retired to the simple but comfortable room that had been prepared for her, Ingrid found sleep elusive. Through the window, she could see the lights of the sanctuary's buildings, where night watches were maintained and early workers prepared for the next day's tasks. The quiet efficiency of it all spoke to something she was only beginning to understand, the power that came not from commanding others, but from serving something greater than oneself. Dawn came earlier than Ingrid had expected, marked not by horns or bells, but by the gentle sounds of a community beginning its daily rhythm. From her window, she could see figures moving purposefully between buildings, their tasks coordinated by years of shared routine rather than barked orders or rigid schedules. She dressed quickly and emerged to find Einar already at work, directing the construction of what appeared to be an addition to one of the smaller buildings. His movements were those of a man half his age, powered by the kind of energy that came from work that fed the soul as well as the body. "You're expanding again," Ingrid observed, noting the careful way foundation stones were being laid. "A family is coming to us," Einar replied, pausing in his work to wipe sweat from his brow. "A man injured in the timber trade, his wife and 3 children. They need space of their own while still being part of our community." The artifact that caught Ingrid's attention was the foundation stone itself, not remarkable for its size or beauty, but for what was carved into its surface. Each family or individual who joined the sanctuary permanently was invited to add their mark to a foundation stone, creating a physical record of the community's growth. The stone Einar was setting bore the carved outline of a pine tree with strong roots, chosen by the incoming family to represent their hope for new growth in a stable place. "You do this for every new resident?" Ingrid asked, kneeling to examine the carving more closely. "Every permanent resident," Leif corrected, appearing with his ever-present ledger and a cup of steaming herbal tea for Ingrid. "Those who stay for healing or temporary shelter are honored guests, but those who choose to make this their home become part of the foundation, literally and figuratively." Ingrid accepted the tea gratefully, noting that it had been prepared exactly as she preferred it, a small kindness that spoke to the attention these people paid to the comfort of others. "How do you determine who stays and who moves on?" "We don't determine anything," Einar said, settling another stone with the precision of a master craftsman. "People choose for themselves when they're ready. Some know within days that this is where they belong. Others need months or even years to heal enough to face the world again. A few discover that their path lies elsewhere, and we celebrate their departure as much as their arrival." The concept of allowing people to define their own readiness challenged Ingrid's understanding of management and control. In her enterprises, decisions were made by those with authority, implemented according to schedules that served efficiency rather than individual need. The idea that a community could function with such flexible boundaries seemed impractical, yet the evidence of its success surrounded her. As the morning progressed, Ingrid found herself drawn into the day's activities almost without conscious decision. She helped Helga in the kitchen, learning techniques for preserving food that would serve her own household well. She observed Thora teaching young women the art of healing, noting how knowledge was shared freely rather than hoarded as a source of power. But it was in the workshop that she encountered something that truly shook her worldview. Bjorn was teaching a boy named Eric, no more than 14, and bearing the marks of severe burns across one side of his face and arm, to carve decorative elements for furniture. The boy's damaged hand couldn't grip tools in the traditional way, but Bjorn had modified techniques and created specialized tools that allowed Eric to work with remarkable skill. "In my father's hall," Eric said, noticing Ingrid's attention, "I was kept hidden because my scars made guests uncomfortable. Here, Master Bjorn says, my different perspective helps me see possibilities that others might miss." Ingrid watched the boy work, his concentration absolute, despite the obvious challenge his injuries presented. The piece he was carving, a delicate vine pattern that would decorate a chest, showed creativity and precision that would have been remarkable in any craftsman, but seemed almost miraculous given his limitations. "How long have you been here?" she asked. 8 months, my lady. Long enough to understand that what you can't do matters less than what you choose to do with what remains. The wisdom in those words, spoken by someone barely out of childhood, forced Ingrid to confront her own assumptions about capability and worth. In her world, damaged goods were discarded or sold at reduced prices. People who couldn't perform to expected standards were dismissed or marginalized. But here, she was seeing limitations transformed into unique strengths. During the afternoon, a messenger arrived from one of the neighboring villages with news that tested the sanctuary's principles in real time. A family had been burned out by raiders, not the organized expeditions that operated under letters of marque, but desperate men driven to violence by their own losses. The survivors needed immediate help. Ingrid watched as the sanctuary responded without hesitation or debate. Supplies were gathered, space was prepared, and a rescue party organized within the span of an hour. What struck her most forcefully was the assumption of responsibility. No one questioned whether they should help, only how they could help most effectively. "Don't you worry about your own security?" she asked Einar as he prepared to lead the rescue party. "Taking in refugees from raider attacks could make you targets yourselves." Einar's smile held no trace of fear or doubt. "Lady Ingrid, security that depends on ignoring the suffering of others isn't really security at all. It's just delayed vulnerability." As she watched the rescue party depart, Ingrid found herself thinking about her own security measures, the guards, the fortified warehouses, the careful selection of trade routes to avoid risk. All of it designed to protect her wealth from those who might want to take it. But Einar's approach suggested a different kind of protection security that came from being valuable to your community rather than isolated from it. The afternoon brought another revelation when a merchant caravan arrived, seeking trade. Ingrid expected to observe simple bartering, but what unfolded was something more sophisticated. The sanctuary traded not just goods, but services, Bjorn's craftsmanship, Thora's healing knowledge, even Leif's accounting skills were offered in exchange for materials they needed. "We've become a resource for the entire region," Leif explained as he negotiated the terms of a complex trade agreement. "People come to us not just for our products, but for our expertise and our reputation for fair dealing." Watching the boy conduct business with the sophistication of a seasoned merchant, Ingrid realized she was witnessing the emergence of a new kind of economic model, one where human development and community welfare generated value rather than competed with it. As evening approached and the rescue party returned with 3 new refugees, Ingrid felt the weight of decisions she could no longer avoid. The evening brought complications that Ingrid hadn't anticipated. As she prepared to bid farewell to the sanctuary, having stretched her one-night stay into a full day and second evening, a familiar figure emerged from the tree line. Gunnar the Red, her chief trade enforcer, and the man responsible for expanding her merchant territories through intimidation when negotiation failed, rode into the sanctuary with a small, armed party. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere. Children who had played freely around Ingrid retreated toward the buildings, and she could see several of the sanctuary's residents positioning themselves protectively near the most vulnerable members of their community. Even Einar's posture shifted, his massive frame settling into the balanced stance of a warrior despite his peaceful pursuits. "Lady Ingrid," Gunnar said, dismounting with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to having his presence command attention. "Your absence has created certain urgencies. The Bergen merchants are threatening to withdraw from our timber agreements if negotiations don't conclude by week's end." Ingrid felt the weight of her commercial responsibilities settling back onto her shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome cloak. The world she had temporarily left behind was reasserting its claims on her attention, demanding that she choose between the sanctuary's revelations and the empire she had spent years building. "We can discuss this privately," she said. But Gunnar's attention had already shifted to the sanctuary's residents, his eyes cataloguing potential threats and weaknesses with professional thoroughness. "Impressive operation," he said to Einar, his tone carrying the particular kind of respect one predator might show another. "I heard tales of the Ironhand's retirement, but I assumed they were exaggerated. This is quite the achievement." The artifact that would define this moment was a war hammer that hung on the wall of the main hall, Einar's weapon from his raiding days, preserved not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Its handle was worn smooth by countless battles, its head marked with nicks and scratches that spoke of violent encounters survived through skill and strength. But most significantly, it had been modified, converted from an instrument of pure destruction into a tool for construction, with mason's marks etched into its surface and a hook added for lifting heavy stones. Einar's eyes followed Gunnar's gaze to the hammer, and when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had nothing left to prove through violence. "That tool serves a different purpose now." "All tools can be repurposed," Gunnar replied, his meaning clear. "The question is whether the craftsman still remembers how to use them properly when circumstances require it." Ingrid felt tension crackling between the two men like lightning before a storm. Both were veterans of violence, both capable of terrible things when motivated, but they represented fundamentally different philosophies about the use of power. She found herself positioned between them, not just physically but philosophically, forced to choose which approach to strength would guide her decisions. "Gunnar," she said firmly, "we're guests here. Show appropriate respect." Her enforcer's surprise at being publicly corrected was evident, but years of service had taught him when to push and when to retreat. He inclined his head slightly, though his attention remained fixed on Einar with the wariness of a professional assessing potential opposition. Leif appeared at Einar's shoulder, his ledger clutched protectively against his chest. To Gunnar's experienced eye, the boy represented nothing more than potential leverage, someone whose safety could be used to influence Einar's behavior. But Ingrid saw something different now. She saw a young man whose courage had been forged in the sanctuary's workshops, whose dignity had been restored through community acceptance. "Master Einar," Leif said quietly, "should I prepare accommodations for Lady Ingrid's men?" The question was practical, but Ingrid heard the subtle challenge in it. The boy was asserting the sanctuary's role as host, their right to set terms for guests within their own walls. It was a small act of defiance that spoke to the confidence this place had given him. "That won't be necessary," Gunnar interjected. "We'll be departing shortly." "Actually," Ingrid found herself saying, "we'll stay the night. My horses need rest, and we can leave fresh in the morning." The decision surprised her as much as it did her men, but something about Gunnar's implicit threat to the sanctuary's peace had crystallized her resolve. She wasn't ready to leave this place, wasn't prepared to abandon the questions it had raised about her own life and choices. As the evening meal proceeded with Gunnar and his men present, Ingrid observed how the sanctuary's residents adapted to potential threat without losing their essential character. Conversations became more subdued, but didn't cease entirely. Children stayed closer to their guardians, but weren't hidden away. The community's response was to protect itself through unity rather than aggression. Gunnar, meanwhile, used the meal to gather intelligence with professional thoroughness. He noted the quality of construction, assessed the defensive potential of the buildings, catalogued the apparent wealth stored in workshops and granaries. Ingrid realized he was automatically evaluating the sanctuary as a target, calculating what it might be worth to raid and how difficult it would be to take. "Quite the operation you've built here," he said to Einar during a lull in conversation. "Must represent considerable investment to maintain so many people." "We maintain ourselves," Einar replied simply. "Everyone contributes according to their abilities. Everyone receives according to their needs." Gunnar's laugh held genuine amusement. A noble sentiment. But what happens when someone decides they need more than they're able to contribute? When hard times come and resources grow scarce? The question struck at the heart of Ingrid's own doubts about the sanctuary's sustainability. In her experience, human nature tended towards selfishness when pressure increased. Generosity was a luxury that few could afford when survival was at stake. "We face that challenge when it comes," Thora answered from her seat near the hearth. "But we've learned that people are capable of remarkable sacrifice when they understand they're part of something larger than themselves." "And if that's not enough?" Gunnar pressed. "If sacrifice isn't sufficient to see you through?" Einar's hand moved unconsciously to his warhammer on the wall, then stopped. When he looked back at Gunnar, his expression was calm, but absolutely resolute. "Then we'll face that failure knowing we chose to try, rather than simply accepting that cruelty was inevitable." The exchange left Gunnar momentarily speechless, not because he lacked arguments, but because Einar's response existed outside the framework of power relationships that governed Gunnar's world. Here was a man who had chosen principle over pragmatism so completely that conventional threats and incentives had lost their meaning. As the evening wound down, Ingrid found herself caught between two visions of how to live in an uncertain world. Gunnar's approach of controlled violence and calculated intimidation, or Einar's commitment to building something worth defending rather than simply taking what others had built. The revelation came in the pre-dawn darkness, when Ingrid couldn't sleep and found herself walking the sanctuary's quiet paths. She discovered Leif sitting by the small shrine Einar had built to honor the dead, not just his own family, but all those whose lives had been lost to the violence that once defined his existence. "I couldn't sleep either," the boy said softly, making room for her on the simple wooden bench. "Sometimes the memories are stronger at night." Ingrid settled beside him, noting how the shrine's central artifact, a simple stone altar bearing hundreds of small carved names, seemed to glow faintly in the starlight. Each name represented someone Einar had killed in his warrior days, painstakingly researched and recorded as an act of remembrance rather than celebration. "He told you about everyone he fought?" Ingrid asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not fought," Leif corrected gently. "Everyone he killed." Master Einar spent 2 years after building this place, traveling to villages and settlements, learning the names of men who died by his hand. He wanted to remember them as people, not just enemies. The magnitude of such an undertaking struck Ingrid like a physical blow. In her world, business casualties were accepted as inevitable costs, farmers displaced by expanding trade routes, craftsmen bankrupted by cheaper imported goods, sailors injured in the pursuit of profit. She had never considered learning their names, much less memorializing them. "How many names?" she asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. 347, Leif replied. "Each one carved by his own hand. He says he'll spend the rest of his life trying to save at least that many lives to balance the scales." As they sat in contemplative silence, Leif began to speak of something Ingrid hadn't expected: his own connection to those carved names. "My father's name is there," he said, pointing to a section of the stone she couldn't quite see in the darkness. "Thorvald the Smith. He died defending our village's grain stores from raiders 8 years ago." Ingrid felt the world tilt beneath her. 8 years ago? But you said you were injured 3 years past. "By different raiders," Leif replied, his voice steady despite the weight of memory. "The first raid took my father. The second took everything else." The terrible arithmetic of violence was becoming clear to Ingrid in ways she had never wanted to understand. Einar's raids had created orphans and widows who became vulnerable to subsequent attacks. The cycle of violence rippled outward in ways that made every act of aggression partially responsible for future suffering. "You knew," she whispered. "When you first met him, you knew he had killed your father. I recognized his description from the stories my mother told before she died. The giant warrior with prayer beads, the Ironhand who took no joy in killing but never hesitated when battle was joined. She said he gave my father an honorable death, a quick end, when capture would have meant torture. Ingrid struggled to comprehend the boy's calm acceptance of such a terrible irony. How can you serve someone who took your father from you? Leif was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns in the dirt at their feet. When he spoke, his words carried wisdom far beyond his years. Master Einar didn't take my father from me, War did that. My father chose to fight for something he believed was worth defending. Master Einar was just the instrument War used that day. But the same hands that swung the sword that killed my father built the sanctuary that saved my life. The same strength that made him feared as a warrior makes him powerful as a protector. The boy's philosophy challenged everything. Ingrid thought she understood about justice and forgiveness. In her world, wrongs demanded restitution, debts required payment, enemies remained enemies until one side achieved decisive victory. But here was a young man who had found a way to separate the man from his actions, the person from their past. "Does he know you know?" she asked. "We've never spoken of it directly," Leif admitted, "but sometimes I catch him watching me with a sadness that goes deeper than sympathy for my injuries. I think he's waiting for me to confront him, to demand some kind of accounting." "And will you?" Leif smiled with a serenity that took Ingrid's breath away. "I think I already have. Every day I choose to stay here, every time I call him master, every moment I spend learning from him instead of hating him, that's my accounting. My father died, defending people he loved. I'm living to protect people I love. The circle isn't broken, just transformed." As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Ingrid found herself staring at the memorial stone with new understanding. It wasn't just a record of Einar's violent past, it was a foundation for his redemptive future. Every name carved there represented not just a death, but a commitment to life. "There's something else you should know," Leif said, his voice taking on a more urgent tone. "About your man, Gunnar, and his interest in our sanctuary." Ingrid turned to face him fully, noting the tension that had entered his posture. 3 of the families who found shelter here, they were displaced by raids conducted under Salmon. Letters of marque bearing your merchant house's seal. Gunnar led 2 of those expeditions personally. The words hit Ingrid like a physical blow. She had known that her expansion into new territories sometimes required forceful negotiations, but she had never inquired too closely about the details. The abstract notion of acceptable losses suddenly had faces and names and stories. "You're certain?" "I keep detailed records," Leif said simply. "Not just of our residents' needs and contributions, but of their histories. When you understand how people came to need sanctuary, you can better help them heal from their experiences." Ingrid found herself thinking of Eric with his burn scars, of the family they had rescued the previous day, of all the other refugees who had found their way to Einar's sanctuary. How many of them were casualties of her own commercial ambitions? "Does Einar know?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Master Einar knows everything. About the people he protects," Leif replied. "Just as he knows the names of everyone he killed as a warrior, he knows who hurt the people he shelters as a protector." The magnitude of the revelation left Ingrid speechless. Einar had welcomed her, shown her hospitality, allowed her to witness the sanctuary's most precious secrets, all while knowing that her actions had created some of the very suffering he was trying to heal. As full daylight approached and the sanctuary began to stir with morning activity, Ingrid realized that everything she thought she understood about her situation had fundamentally changed. She wasn't just a potential patron evaluating a charitable enterprise, she was complicit in the very problems the sanctuary existed to solve. The confrontation Ingrid had been dreading came sooner than expected. As the sanctuary stirred to life around them, Gunnar emerged from his quarters with the purposeful stride of a man who had reached important decisions during the night. His eyes found Ingrid immediately, and she could see in his expression that their extended stay had convinced him something significant was happening. "My lady," he said, approaching with the deference he showed in public, but an undertone that suggested private conversations would be less respectful. "We need to discuss your commitments. The Bergen situation requires immediate attention." Ingrid found herself looking around the sanctuary with new eyes, seeing not just the impressive construction and peaceful community life, but the faces of people whose suffering she had inadvertently caused. The weight of revelation made every decision feel monumentally important. "Give me another hour," she said, knowing she was prolonging an inevitable reckoning but unable to face it immediately. Gunnar's jaw tightened with barely contained frustration. "My lady, with respect, whatever spell this place has cast over you needs to be broken quickly. Your empire requires your attention more than these people require your sympathy." The word empire hung in the air between them, and Ingrid realized that until this moment she had never truly considered what building an empire meant in human terms. She had thought in abstractions, market share, profit margins, territorial expansion, without fully grappling with the reality that empires were built on the displacement and suffering of those who stood in their path. Einar appeared as if summoned by the tension in the air, his massive presence somehow calming rather than threatening, despite Gunnar's obvious unease. In his hands he carried the artifact that would define this crucial moment, a wooden ledger bound in simple leather, its pages filled with detailed records of every person the sanctuary had helped and the circumstances that had brought them there. "Lady Ingrid," he said quietly, "I believe there are some things we should discuss before you make your final decision about the land." The ledger represented something unprecedented in Ingrid's experience, a systematic accounting of compassion, a business record that measured success not in accumulated wealth, but in lives restored and futures rebuilt. As Einar opened it, she could see page after page of careful entries, each one documenting someone's journey from desperation to dignity. "Gunnar," Ingrid said, her voice carrying a firmness that surprised them both, "wait for me by the horses." Her enforcer's eyes narrowed dangerously. "My lady, I strongly advise against conducting any further business without proper counsel present." "This isn't business," Ingrid replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "This is something else entirely." Gunnar's expression made clear that he recognized the subtle shift in their relationship dynamic, but after a moment's hesitation, he gave a curt nod and withdrew. His departure left Ingrid alone with Einar and Leif, surrounded by the morning sounds of a community she now understood in entirely new terms. "You know about the raids," she said simply. It wasn't a question. Einar nodded, his fingers tracing the edge of the ledger's worn cover. "I know that 12 of our residents were displaced by expeditions bearing your house's authorization. I know that Gunnar led several of those raids personally. I know that your expansion into timber territories has followed the same pattern that my own campaigns once did. Take what you want, drive off those who resist, justify the consequences as the natural order of things." The calm recitation of facts stung more than any accusation could have. Ingrid found herself facing the mirror of her own actions, reflected through someone who understood violence from both sides. "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" she asked. "Because I wanted you to see what was possible before you were forced to confront what was past," Einar replied. "I wanted you to understand what people could become when they're given the chance to heal, to grow, to contribute. I hoped that understanding might change how you choose to move forward." Leif stepped forward, his ledger open to a page that detailed the arrival of Eric and his family, the boy with burn scars, whose creativity had so impressed Ingrid. The entry noted that they had been refugees from a timber settlement that had refused to accept Ingrid's terms for exclusive harvesting rights. His village chose to fight rather than surrender their ancestral lands, Leif said quietly. Gunnar's men burned the settlement when negotiation failed. Eric was caught in a burning building while trying to save his grandmother. Ingrid closed her eyes, remembering her conversation with the boy, his quiet dignity despite his injuries, his pride in the work he had learned to do with damaged hands. She had admired his resilience without understanding that it had been forged in fires Her own decisions had lit. "How many others?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. Einar turned pages in the ledger, each one representing lives disrupted by the collision between her ambitions and their resistance. The widow, Sigrid, whose husband died defending a fishing village that refused to accept your monopoly on their catch. The brothers, Olaf and Magnus, orphaned when their parents were killed resisting the seizure of their grain stores. Little Astrid, who hasn't spoken since watching her family's farm burned for refusing to accept your agent's prices for their harvest. Each name struck Ingrid like a physical blow. She had known that business was sometimes brutal, had accepted that expansion required displacing competitors, but she had never been forced to confront the human faces behind the abstract casualties of commerce. "And yet you welcomed me here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You showed me hospitality, treated me with respect." "Because I've learned that people can change," Einar replied simply. "I've learned that the worst things we've done don't have to define what we choose to do next. But change requires honest accounting of the past and a commitment to different choices in the future." Around them, the sanctuary continued its morning routine, children heading to lessons, craftsmen beginning their work, healers tending to those who needed care. But Ingrid now saw all of it differently, understanding that this peaceful community existed partly as a response to violence she had authorized. "What would you have me do?" she asked, the weight of responsibility settling onto her shoulders like a burden she wasn't sure she could bear. Leif spoke before Einar could answer. "The same thing Master Einar did," he said simply. "Acknowledge what was broken and choose to build something better." The boy's words carried the authority of someone who had survived both the breaking and the rebuilding. Standing before her was living proof that transformation was possible, that people could choose healing over revenge, construction over destruction. "I have obligations," Ingrid said, but even as she spoke the words she could hear how hollow they sounded. "People depend on my enterprises for their livelihoods." "Yes," Einar agreed. "The question is whether you'll use that dependence to justify continuing harmful practices, or whether you'll find ways to meet those obligations while also meeting your responsibilities to people like those who found shelter here." From the direction of the horses, Ingrid could hear Gunnar's voice, raised in conversation with her other men. She could imagine the substance of that discussion, warnings about her apparent enchantment with the sanctuary, concerns about delayed business, questions about whether their lady had lost sight of practical necessities. But standing in the sanctuary's peaceful morning, surrounded by evidence of what was possible when power was used to lift up rather than tear down, Ingrid found herself questioning which approach was truly practical. Was it more realistic to build an empire through force and fear, or to create lasting prosperity through cooperation and mutual benefit? The choice she made in the next few moments would determine not just the sanctuary's future, but the very nature of the legacy she would leave behind. The confrontation erupted like a storm that had been building for days. Gunnar appeared in the sanctuary's courtyard with 3 of Ingrid's guards flanking him, their hands resting on sword hilts in a display that was just short of openly threatening. "Lady Ingrid," he called across the space, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had decided patience was no longer a virtue. "Your responsibilities cannot wait any longer. We're leaving within the hour." Around the courtyard, the sanctuary's residents froze in their morning activities. Children moved closer to adults, and Ingrid could see several of the former warriors positioning themselves protectively near the most vulnerable members of their community. The messy, peaceful atmosphere that had defined her stay was suddenly charged with the potential for violence. Einar stepped forward, placing himself between Gunnar's party and the rest of the sanctuary. His movements were calm and deliberate, but Ingrid recognized the shift in his posture from builder to protector, from craftsman to warrior. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. "You're welcome to wait for Lady Ingrid's decision," Einar said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. But you'll wait respectfully, or you'll wait elsewhere." Gunnar's laugh was sharp with disbelief. The great Einar the Ironhand, reduced to threatening visitors over a few peasants and cripples. How far the mighty have fallen. The insult to the sanctuary's residents sparked visible anger among the former warriors who had found homes there. Bjorn One Eye stepped from his workshop, a heavy mallet in his scarred hands. Two other men emerged from the stables, their own weapons close at hand. The sanctuary might have been dedicated to peace, but it was defended by people who remembered how to fight when necessary. "Gunnar," Ingrid said sharply, stepping forward before the situation could escalate further. "Stand down. These people have shown us nothing but courtesy." Her enforcer's eyes fixed on her with an intensity that bordered on insubordination. "My lady, I've served your house for 20 years. I've seen you build an empire through strength and determination. Don't let one peaceful morning undo decades of practical success." The artifact that would define this moment was visible on Einar's belt, a simple knife used for everyday tasks around the sanctuary, but which Ingrid recognized as having been forged from the metal of one of his old weapons. The blade had been reshaped from an instrument of war into a tool of daily utility, its edge now used for carving wood, preparing food, and performing the countless small tasks that kept community functioning. Success? Ingrid found herself asking, the word feeling strange in her mouth as she looked around at the sanctuary's residents. "What exactly have I been successful at, Gunnar?" Her question seemed to catch him off guard. "You've built the largest merchant fleet in the Northern Territories. You control trade routes from the Baltic to the North Sea. You command wealth that rivals any Jarl's. And what has that wealth cost?" Ingrid pressed, gesturing toward Eric, who had emerged from the workshop to watch the confrontation. "How many villages burned to secure my trade routes? How many families displaced to expand my territories?" Gunnar's expression hardened with the frustration of someone trying to explain obvious truths to someone who had inexplicably lost sight of them. "The cost of any great enterprise, my lady. Some must fall so that others may rise. That's the natural order of things." "Is it?" Leif's voice cut through the tension, the boy stepping forward with his ever-present ledger clutched against his chest. "Or is that just what we tell ourselves, to justify taking what we want from people too weak to stop us?" Gunnar's attention shifted to the boy with the predatory focus of someone identifying a potential vulnerability. A touching speech from someone who exists only because others pay the costs he's too weak to bear himself. The casual cruelty of the comment sparked something dangerous in the sanctuary's residents. Several men moved closer, their hands moving to tools that could serve as weapons if necessary. But it was Einar who responded, his voice carrying the quiet menace of someone who had forgotten more about violence than most people would ever learn. "That boy has more strength in his damaged leg than you've shown in your entire life," he said, each word precisely chosen and delivered with absolute conviction. "Real strength isn't about taking what you want from those who can't stop you. It's about building something worth defending." Gunnar's hand moved to his sword hilt, a gesture that immediately escalated the confrontation. "Pretty words from someone who spent decades doing exactly what I do now. At least I don't pretend my violence serves some higher purpose." "You're right," Einar admitted, his own hand moving to the simple knife at his belt not as a threat, but as a reminder of transformation. "For 30 years I told myself that strength meant the ability to take what I wanted, that success was measured by how much I could accumulate through force. I was wrong." The admission hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. Ingrid found herself looking back and forth between the two men, seeing in their confrontation the choice she was being asked to make between the familiar brutality that had built her empire and the uncertain path towards something better. "My lady," Gunnar said, his voice taking on a tone of desperate urgency, "whatever guilt this place has made you feel, Remember that your empire supports hundreds of families. Your ships provide livelihoods for sailors. Your warehouses employ dock workers. Your trade routes benefit entire communities. You cannot sacrifice all of that for the sake of sentiment. His argument carried genuine force. Ingrid's commercial enterprises did provide employment and economic stability for many people. Her ships brought goods from distant lands. Her warehouses stored grain that fed communities during harsh winters. Her trade networks connected isolated settlements to broader prosperity. But standing in the sanctuary, surrounded by people whose lives had been shattered by the methods she had used to build that empire, she found herself questioning whether the benefits justified the costs, whether prosperity built on others' suffering could truly be called success. "There has to be another way," she said, though she wasn't entirely certain what that way might look like. Gunnar's expression shifted from frustration to something approaching pity. "There is no other way, my lady. This sanctuary exists only because Einar accumulated enough wealth through violence to retire from it. Your empire exists only because you've been willing to use force when negotiation failed. Take away that willingness, and everything you've built will crumble." His words struck at the heart of Ingrid's deepest fears. Was the sanctuary simply a luxury that only those who had already accumulated power through violence could afford? Was her wealth so tainted by its origins that any attempt to use it more ethically would be hypocritical? Around them, the confrontation balanced on a knife's edge, waiting for Ingrid's decision to tip it toward violence or peace. The decision that would define everything came not through grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but through a simple question from the most unexpected source. "Lady Ingrid," said a small voice from behind her. She turned to see Astrid, the little girl who hadn't spoken since her family's farm was burned, standing with something clutched in her tiny hands. "Is this yours?" The artifact the child offered was a simple silver coin, bearing the seal of Ingrid's merchant house payment that had been dropped or left behind during one of the raids that had destroyed so many lives. The coin gleamed in the morning light, its intricate design marking it as valuable currency in the world of commerce and trade. But held in the hands of this traumatized child, it became something else entirely. A symbol of the connection between Ingrid's prosperity and others' suffering, a physical link between the wealth she had accumulated and the lives that had been shattered in its pursuit. Ingrid knelt slowly, bringing herself to the child's eye level. Up close, she could see the careful way Astrid held herself, the watchful tension that spoke of someone who had learned too young that safety was never guaranteed. This was the first time the girl had spoken since arriving at the sanctuary, and she had chosen to break her silence with a question that cut straight to the heart of everything. "Where did you find this?" Ingrid asked gently. Astrid's voice was barely above a whisper. "In the ashes, after the fire. I kept it because it was pretty." The simple explanation struck Ingrid with devastating force. This child had salvaged a coin from the ruins of her family's life, had carried it as one of the few possessions she had left after losing everything. And now she was offering it back, not knowing that she was handing Ingrid a piece of her own complicity. Around them, the confrontation between Gunnar and the sanctuary's defenders continued to simmer. But the child's innocent question had created a moment of profound quiet. Even Gunnar seemed to recognize that something significant was happening, though he clearly didn't understand what. "Yes," Ingrid said softly, accepting the coin from Astrid's small hands. "This is mine." The admission carried weight far beyond the simple acknowledgement of ownership. In accepting the coin, Ingrid was accepting responsibility for the chain of events that had brought it here, for the decisions that had led to this child's trauma, for the system of violence and displacement that had made her wealthy while leaving others broken. "Can I keep it?" Astrid asked, her voice still small, but carrying a child's straightforward honesty. "Master Einar says we can keep things that help us remember who we used to be." Ingrid looked down at the coin in her hands, seeing it now not as a symbol of her success, but as a reminder of costs she had been unwilling to acknowledge. But the child's request transformed its meaning again, from a burden of guilt into a token of connection, a bridge between past harm and future healing. "Of course you can keep it," Ingrid said, placing the coin back in Astrid's hands. "But would you like me to tell you a story about it? About what it could mean for your future, instead of just your past?" The girl nodded solemnly, her eyes fixed on Ingrid's face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read adults carefully for signs of safety or danger. Ingrid stood slowly, her decision crystallizing as she spoke. "This coin represents a choice," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "It can represent the old way of doing things, taking what we want without regard for who gets hurt. Or it can represent something new." She turned to face Gunnar, seeing in his expression the recognition that he was losing a battle he hadn't fully understood he was fighting. "The old way ends today." "My lady," Gunnar said, his voice tight with controlled desperation, "you're making a mistake that will destroy everything you've worked to build." "No," Ingrid replied, feeling the weight of certainty settling in her chest like an anchor finding solid ground. "I'm choosing to build something worth keeping." The transformation was visible in her posture, in the way she stood among the sanctuary's residents as if she belonged there rather than merely visiting. Gunnar saw it too, and his hand moved again to his sword hilt, not as a threat to the sanctuary, but as a final assertion of the philosophy she was rejecting. "You cannot run an empire on sentiment," he said coldly. "When reality comes calling, these people will offer you nothing but pretty words and noble intentions." "Then I'll find another way to define success," Ingrid replied. "One that doesn't require burning other people's homes to light my own." The finality in her voice left no room for argument, but Gunnar made one last attempt to salvage the situation. "What about your obligations? Your ships, your warehouses, your trade agreements? You cannot simply abandon everything." Ingrid smiled, feeling peace settle over her for the first time in years. "I'm not abandoning anything. I'm transforming it. 1 year later, the changes were visible from the fjord's entrance. Where once Einar's sanctuary had stood alone in the wilderness, a thriving settlement now spread along the water's edge. Ships bearing Ingrid's modified house seal, the old raven of commerce, now carrying an olive branch in its talons, rode at anchor in the deep harbour. But these vessels served purposes their predecessors never could have imagined. The transformation hadn't been easy. Gunnar had departed that morning 12 months past, taking with him several of Ingrid's guards and her blessing to seek employment elsewhere. Within weeks, word had spread through the merchant community that the Iron Rose, as competitors had nicknamed her, had gone soft. Former allies distanced themselves, trade agreements were challenged, and rival houses moved aggressively to claim territories she had once controlled through force. But Ingrid had discovered something her competitors didn't understand. An empire built on mutual benefit proved more durable than one maintained through fear. The villages that had once submitted to her demands out of necessity now chose to trade with her out of preference. Her ships carried not just goods but craftsmen who taught new skills, healers who shared knowledge, teachers who brought literacy to remote settlements. The sanctuary itself had evolved into something unprecedented, a school, a hospital, a workshop, and a trading post, all combined into one institution. Leif now managed not just the records of residents, but complex agreements with dozens of communities that had chosen partnership over exploitation. His wooden leg brace had been replaced by a more sophisticated device, crafted by artisans who had learned their skills in the expanded workshops, and he moved through his responsibilities with the confidence of someone who had found his true calling. Einar stood on the dock where Ingrid's latest ship was unloading, but instead of weapons or tools of conquest, the cargo consisted of books, medicines, and raw materials that would be transformed in the sanctuary's workshops into goods that served human need rather than human greed. His prayer beads still hung at his wrist, but they had been joined by a new addition, a small carved bird that Astrid had made for him, her way of saying thank you for helping her find her voice again. The settlement now housed nearly 200 people, but it wasn't the size that made it remarkable, it was the nature of the growth. Each new resident arrived not as a refugee or charity case, but as someone whose skills and perspective would strengthen the whole community. Former raiders worked alongside former victims, their shared commitment to building something better, transcending the grievances of the past. "The Bergen merchants are asking for another meeting," Leif reported, approaching Einar with his daily summary of correspondence. "They're offering significant concessions if we'll consider expanding our operations to their territory." Einar smiled, remembering when such news would have meant planning raids or negotiating tributes. Now it meant evaluating whether they could help establish similar communities elsewhere without compromising the principles that made their own settlement successful. "What does Ingrid think?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "She says we should be cautious about growth that serves our pride more than our purpose," Leif replied. "But she's interested in the possibility of teaching others what we've learned here." From the main hall came the sounds of evening preparation, children helping with meal arrangements, adults sharing the day's accomplishments and challenges, the elderly offering wisdom gained through decades of experience. It was a sound that had become as familiar and comforting as ocean waves, the rhythm of a community that had learned to value each person's contribution. Ingrid emerged from the expanded library, where she had been working on plans for a new kind of trade agreement, one that measured success not just in silver accumulated, but in lives improved. Her auburn hair showed more silver than it had a year before, but her step was lighter, her shoulders less burdened by the weight of decisions that required others to suffer for her success. "Any word from Gunnar?" Einar asked, though the question had become more curiosity than concern. "He's found work with a merchant house in the southern territories," Ingrid replied. "Apparently building an empire the old way. Some habits are harder to change than others." She didn't sound bitter about her former enforcer's choice. The transformation she had undergone had taught her that people changed at their own pace, in their own time, when they were ready to embrace something better than what they had known before. As the sun set over the fjord, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson, the three of them stood together watching. Children play along the shoreline. These weren't just the orphans and refugees who had originally found shelter here, but new families who had chosen to make the settlement their home because of what it represented. Little Astrid ran past them, her laughter bright and unrestrained. The silver coin Ingrid had given her worn smooth and polished from constant handling. It hung on a cord around her neck now, no longer a reminder of loss, but a symbol of possibility, proof that even the darkest chapters of a story could be transformed into something luminous. "Do you ever miss it?" Ingrid asked Einar, as they watched the peaceful evening unfold. "The simplicity of taking what you wanted instead of building what others needed?" Einar's hand moved unconsciously to his prayer beads, then to the small carved bird Astrid had made him. "I miss thinking I knew who I was," he admitted, "but I wouldn't trade who I've become for who I used to be." The settlement around them represented more than successful social experiment or profitable enterprise. It was proof that the strongest foundations weren't built on conquest, but on compassion, that the most enduring empires were those that lifted others up rather than ground them down under the wheel of progress. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Ingrid found herself thinking of all the choices that had led to this moment. The decision to stay that first night, the courage to confront her own complicity in others' suffering, the faith to believe that transformation was possible even for someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of taking rather than giving. The settlement would continue to grow and evolve, facing new challenges and discovering new possibilities. But its foundation was solid now, built not on the shifting ground of fear and force, but on the bedrock of human dignity and mutual respect. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't the wealth accumulated or territories conquered, but the simple recognition that true strength meant building something worth defending, rather than simply defending what had been taken from others. Sometimes the greatest warriors really were those who chose to lay down their swords,